If you think about it, we're anime characters in Rumble. And every anime character needs a radar chart, so that includes you, Rumbler. I started thinking about this a year ago when I made the Flick video. I wanted a way to show the diversity of playstyles, so with the help of whoever responded at the time, got a few ideas and developed a system to categorize players. Since then, not everybody has read the extensive documentation, and so there are some misconceptions I want to clear up. And I also want to help you make your radar chart. So we're going to go through it all, but I will say that this system is just my system of looking at the game, and it's not the only one. It's cool to see people analyze the game through their own lens, and it also helps me to see how I could make my chart better. So shout out to Crom, which we'll talk about later. Oh, by the way, I'm playing my boss Lopes here. It's one of the bosses from Patreon. He's actually recovering from some foot surgery and playing from a chair. Can you believe how well he plays?
Oh, he gets around it.
I'm actually grading him in this footage for his radar chart, which is one of the patron perks. It's one of the higher tier perks too, so Lopes is really bankrolling me here. But really, you could get anyone to do it. We'll go through the system so you can make your own for free. Don't worry about me.
I deserve that. I deserve when I'm playing sweaty against a guy in a chair. Do you feel a bit shorter than usual in the chair?
So there are 6 categories: mobility, aerial, spawn pace, range bias, reactivity, and creativity. Point 1, the radar chart is not an indication of skill, it is a representation of playstyle. So, if you're suffering from crippling skill issue, you could have the same radar chart as Ender if you try to play in a similar way. Because it's not about skill, it's about playstyle. Although there's a little bit of a skill factor involved, and I'll cover that later. Step 1 to the chart is understanding the key 3. Within a game of Rumble, you are either summoning and comboing, moving, or waiting to counter your opponent. Now this may be reductive, there's no end to that sentence. Mobility is speed, dashing, jumping, and IRL dodging. Spawn pace, how often you summon structures and then combo them. Reactivity is redirecting an opponent's summons or using situational plays or being patient to find the perfect window. Overall, I think those 3 are broad enough categories to start painting a picture of what someone might spec into. Because there is a finite amount of physical poses you can do within a match, this is about playstyle, not skill. The 1 to 5 level of each represents how much you're doing that aspect of the game within a match. And between those 3, you have a pool of 11 points to assign. There are some archetypes. You got a 4-4-3. That's an all-rounder, good use of all traits. And one doesn't really outshine the other. You could even be a true all-rounder at 3-3-3. It's not bad to not use all the points. You could be a dual specialist, speccing a 5-5 into 2 things, but then you barely move. Or you could be a specialist with a secondary. Got one key playstyle of pace, but you're also a movement gremlin. And like I said, you don't have to use them all. You could make a statement because there's a max of 5, so you could go 5 for reactivity and you spend most of the match just waiting. But you got 2 for mobility because you don't need to move, you're waiting, and you got a 2 for pace because you only really use discs to disc jump.
Forget bro.
It used to be 12, but it was kind of boring to see people max out almost everything because they thought they were hot schist coming out of the earth. So I reduced it to 11. I even thought about making it 10 because the shapes are more interesting when we have limits and you're forced to make difficult decisions. Now, I said you don't need to assign all points and you can't go past 5. There are some edge cases, maybe we'll come back to later. But you got to crack out of this mindset that having a low number equals bad. That's just not the case. Everything on the chart is neutral, neither good nor bad. If you have low mobility, you just might not need to move because you have such a high pace. Or you could have low pace because you care more to counterplay. So take this idea of low number equals bad out of your head. Now that being said, what if you are just bad? There is a little bit of skill involved in the chart. If you're just starting and aren't like 80% consistent with all your poses, you may not be using every second of play optimally. So you might want to start with 8 or 9 points and be humble, knowing you have room to improve. Plus, how cool will it be when you do improve and you get to adjust your chart to add points? You can't do that if you just put everything in to make you look like Ender, even though you're a sub 1k BP player. Links to the radar chart in the description, and special shout out to Crowned
Oh, I didn't mean to do that.
and Cotton for both making separate tools to make radar charts more accessible. They're free and easy to use, way easier than the first one I used in the Flick video. So thanks to them. Now let's look at the stats.
Still got it up.
Mobility, sprinting, dashing, jumping, IRL dodging, and at high levels, you're using disc jumps, air slings, drifting, destroy boosts, backslides, mojo dashes, click and hold, bumping,
thought I could
flight,
ground
and
it.
everything in between. If you're a 1, you got your boots firmly planted, you barely move. This is pretty rare. 2, you're below average, and you only dash or run when necessary. This would usually be a pace player who runs out of room on the ring. 3 is like average, but it's not your style. 4, you're constantly sprinting, dashing, or jumping, and mobility is a part of your style. You might focus on IRL dodging and ducking, and you could incorporate advanced tech, but you might not use it throughout the whole match. And a 5, that means mobility is your specialty, and you're definitely going to be using some advanced mobility tech that's rarely seen. Now, with the next one, some critics of the radar chart aren't a fan of aerial being included. But I think we know by now how much aerial playstyles affect the game. Otherwise, Rumble is a 2.5D fighting game, if you think about it. Not side-scrolling, but top-down. Aerial play added the third dimension, up. Now the primary purpose of this chart, I think, is the most misunderstood, underutilized thing. And to be honest, that's my own fault due to laziness and not doing this enough. I'll get to the primary, but the secondary is what we've talked about, and that's just for you to make this chart for yourself for a better understanding of your own game. It's a tool for that, but the primary is, once you have it, is to compare 2 charts before a fight, so you might get a picture of what that fight might look like. And overall, help us to analyze the scissor, paper, rock nature of different playstyles at the end of a battle. Because if you see someone with max aerial versus someone who doesn't leave the ground, you know it's going to be a one-sided fight, with one person focusing on aerial attacks and the other purely anti-air. If 2 aerial players are fighting, you know you're in for a magical treat. And if 2 grounded players are playing, then you can skip watching that match. Just kidding. Sorry for the offensive joke. But getting to the actual stat, aerial is determined by how much damage you're doing from within the air or after doing something from the air. So it's not just disc jumping around and you happen to be in the air. It's if you have an aerial projectile style where you jump and then throw something to get a better angle. Or the flick style, where you come in flying with a wall, use it to true combo them into a stun lock and deal heaps of damage. The damage done from hitting in the air and following up from the air is all included in the stat. So if you're a 1, less than 10% of damage done is from the air, rarely used. 2 is 20%, do it every so often. 3, 30%. Your aerials are reliably used in combat. 4 is 40%, which is definitely above average use of aerial damage. And 5 is 50% plus, where a majority of damage is being done from aerials or combos from aerials in the follow-up. In rare cases, maybe a 0 could be argued if a player never jumped. They're out there. Spawn pace, that's kind of obvious. How often does a player summon structures and then use them? 0 is you spawn nothing. That's virtually unheard of, but not out of the realm of possibility. 1, you rarely spawn, all your energy is focused on movement and on counterplay. 2 is just a below average spawn pace, 3 is average, 4 is a higher pace than most. Usually this player does a lot of chip damage, and might use less walls than most because they're slower to spawn. They're trying to overwhelm someone who doesn't meet their pace. And 5 is they do almost nothing but spawn and attack. Mindless machines of rock production. That's a 5. Now we have range bias. We're getting somewhere interesting. Of course, there are a lot of limitations with the radar chart. You might have a few different playstyles. You might play differently depending on who you verse, and you could definitely have a host style and a client style. But this chart is about when push comes to shove, you're the host and someone is taking you to your limit. What are the tools you rely upon? I know hundreds of moves. I can't mentally use them all. If I want to learn something new, I have to intentionally focus on using it in battle. Even if I want to use some of the iconic moves I love, I have to really intentionally focus. Otherwise, I have a based instinct flow state style that when I'm pushed to my limit, those moves come out, and there's definitely a pattern to that. And I would argue everybody has some kind of pattern.
All right.
No,
So
you're good.
you like... All right, I'm thinking about your chart.
Mm-hmm.
You lose.
You like delayed peristasis. So you might have like quite a longer range bias than most.
Yeah,
Because-
I usually try to play from a distance if I can help it.
You kind of back away. You like the space. And then... It's a bit of aerial stuff.
I try for aerials if I can.
Or the radar chart could just be how you like to play. That's alright too. And you know what? If you want to have a few based on your different styles, that's fine too. But coming back to range bias. For some people, when they're pushed to the limit, they turn on that aggression and they want to rush into danger and stack damage with close quarter combat. Others like to keep their distance using long combos and try to play more defensive. That's what the range bias is. The distance from your opponent you naturally fall into. The higher the stat, the longer the range. 1 is within punching distance. This is like cube launches on an opponent or flick style moves. 2 is within a wall straights distance. So you're not going to get cube launched, but this is still almost point blank. 2.5 we have as a special rating if you're a yo-yo style player, bouncing between long-range sniping and short-range spam. This could be like you get 1 bit of damage off at close range just so you could disc jump away and set something up big. But if you're jumping away far to set up an aerial that's a flick that goes into close range, I still count that. The flick style is kind of a 2.5, bouncing between the closeness of the hits then backing away to set up again. 3 is the average distance between players, and that's like the range of 3-hit combos and strut uppercuts. Probably the distance between spawns. 4 is longer than that, where you're going for 4-hit wall combos. You might be going for speed discs or faster balls to keep pressure on at that distance. And 5 is almost only speed disc range, or maybe aerial projectiles. Across the map kind of stuff. Now something I like about the rival system, Crom, is the stat called aggression, because there is this feeling that some players are more aggressive than others. So in closer detail, their aggression would be covered mainly in my spawn pace and reactivity, but in 1 stat, which is a cool different way of looking at it. But I also realize there's another aspect to aggression that's covered in my chart, which is all about positioning and not to do with pace or initiating trades. My fault for a long time that I was too aggressive of a player trying to get in close to do damage. And so when I versed someone who was not aggressive, who was always moving backwards as I was pushing forwards, they had a huge advantage and I would usually lose because I dash into something. It's when you overlay 2 range biases that the difference will tell you who's going to be more aggressive in a match. Like I said, I like to get in close, but my opponent might be a 4 hanging back. So I'll end up being the more aggressive one in that situation, pushing into their space. And they might rely on their mobility to backpedal as I'm pushing in. If it's 2 4-range players, you're going to have a long-range battle, and it's not going to feel as close up as intense. And if it's a 3v3 or a 2v2, both fighters are going to match each other's aggression, and there'll sort of be an equilibrium as to how far apart they are. Now combine that gap in a range bias, plus looking at the balance between reactivity, pace, and mobility, and you're going to start to get a picture of what a fight might look like.
Oh, that was just hurtful, Shoeless.
Yeah, that's a savage combo.
What is happening? Oh, my back was to a boulder. That's what was happening.
Yeah.
Oh, come on.
Speedrun?
Can't
Speedrun
do that
attempt.
twice.
Chat, was that a speedrun record?
I'm beginning to understand. I see it. I remember. Again, the radar chart's primary focus is to try and predict how playstyle matchups might look, and therefore help us understand the game better. Reactivity, that's about redirecting an opponent's summons, using situational plays, or having the patience to hold on to a structure waiting for the perfect opening. Now, if you're a 0, you're just not even going to interact with your opponent's summons at all. If you're a 1, you rarely parry, RTS, or stomp. You're not using situational plays. You're mostly going to rely on your own structures to net 0 out other people's incoming stuff.
Oh, the 6. The 6. Never try and jump between me and my cube.
2 is you got your parries, RTSs, or stomps, but only when absolutely necessary and something comes through your defenses. Rather than using those defensive options, you'd more likely rather dodge or just cancel out structures with your own structures. A 3 is average. In the mix of your movement and pace is counterplays and keeping an eye out for some situational plays to use to your advantage. 4 is being patient. You would rather counterattack than use your own summons. You could be a charge stone user waiting for a powerful strike, Or you could be an explosive player looking out for ricochets or improvised railguns, chambering. Now 5 is total zen. Almost no structures are wasted, and they will rarely make the first move besides using chip damage
We'll have
to
to do
pressure
another
their
one when I'm
opponent to
standing
do
again.
something
Yeah.
so they make a mistake.
So I'm
We could
thinking,
really not close the normal kind of server.
what is it? What would it be? 4 for reactivity, 3 for movement, 3 for pace. That's what I'm thinking.
Alright, the last one. Perhaps the most controversial. I've tried to put my range biases aside so far, and if 2 grounded players are playing, then you can skip watching that match. But it seems I can't hide it any longer. I love to encourage creative play. Back in the day, there was a very clear and obvious meta. Pace and a bit of movement and reactivity, but ultimately people relied on overwhelming with net zeros until someone had faster combos than another person straight down the line. Boring. Now, it wasn't the meta because it was necessarily the best, although it kind of was. It was the meta because the player base hadn't come up with a vision for creative playstyles. I'm not saying this is propaganda for me and Flick. That's just one example. There are people like FJM who are really creative with an aerial projectile style, or Mr. Mister with handling multiple structures and his high reactivity. There was also high mobility players. Then railgunners came along. Explosive players, like I've said. Creativity is really important to me. Low creativity, it's not bad. It just means a player chooses to rely on the fundamentals that are tried and true. In fact, highly creative players are usually highly punishable because it takes such a high level of refinement and skill and game sense to make new kinds of plays effective. So I think it should be rewarded and celebrated if someone chooses to make their win condition not having the most green dots, but having the most fun pushing forward new techniques and moves. In saying that, creativity is quite subjective as a measure. I'm not going to change it, but I have considered making the stat versatility instead. Versatility is covered within the umbrella of creativity, but it'd be more specific and would be a measure of how many tools a player has in their toolkit. Meta players, let's be honest, use the same 2 or 3 combos on each structure all the time. A versatile player would take advantage of unpredictability. They change the pace of play with mix-ups and variants of moves that they have to prevent being telegraphed. That being said, it's still creativity for now. So let's look at what it could be. Could be like unique damage combos and structure combos. Could be unique use of shift stones to create synergies. Could be like traps and tricks or railguns, parry stasis. That's what Lopes is doing here, and that's what gave him a 5 for creativity. Same with Omelette du Fromage, who I did last week, who got a 5 for his client flight. Use of weird bugs, cutting edge tech that is uncommon to see. Flick, it's just a fact, objective, it's creative, it's cool. But if you got a 0, you never had an original thought, and that's okay. You're a fundamentalist at heart. 1 is a strong meta play, and that's a statement. 2, you're not afraid to mix in new techniques and surprises. 3, you've got plenty of mix-ups, and you're not predictable. 4 is more of that, and 5 does not play like any other players, completely unique in style. And that makes up the radar chart. If you want to become my boss on Patreon, I'd be eternally grateful. And at a certain tier, I'd be so grateful, I'll make you your own radar chart by pushing you to your limit and seeing what comes out. Like I did for Lopes and Omelette du Fromage. Otherwise, just play around, fight someone and ask them for their opinion. It's always better to have an outside look at you. And since a lot of this stuff is based on vibes of what is average, it helps having a more experienced player let you know how you stack up. Oh, you know where the radar chart was really well used? The Flick video. Maybe you should brush up on that before the sequel comes out. Minimum 2 weeks, just like the dev said about the cosmetic update a year ago.
Oh, I thought you meant like emotion. Yeah.